Podcast. See what's on your mind. It's the Treatable Podcast. Real, coming, treatable. It's the Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
No matter what side of the political fence you fall on, most people agree that our country has issues. If we personified the United States as a family, we'd probably call that family dysfunctional, at the very least. But what if, like we often wish our dysfunctional family members would, America went to therapy? What would that conversation be like? Welcome to the Treatable Podcast with me, your host, Clint Mally. Today, we're unpacking the amazing book, America in Therapy, a new approach to hope and healing for a nation in crisis. We're going to take a look at some really interesting questions, like what kind of family is America exactly? And what are the power dynamics that are at play that mirror families? And how can a psychotherapeutic approach help us heal the division that our country is so clearly suffering under? Here to help us dig deep into these concepts is the author herself, Phyllis E. Levitt. Phyllis is an expert in her field, having been a psychotherapist for 34 years. And during this time, she's worked extensively with abuse and dysfunctional family dynamics, witnessed the consequences of such dynamics, and learned key strategies for healing them.
Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
Phyllis, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to talk with you.
So we're going to unpack this. I'm going to go ahead and preface listeners, hey, we're going to be talking about some stuff that's going to be politically charged. We're going to be talking about current events. And usually these things are divided on party lines, divided on topic lines. And so my goal in this conversation is to at least table set that, hey, we want to make sure that we're able to have a conversation about this. Regardless of your political beliefs or your ideologies, I'm hoping that we can at least look at the United States or America through the lens of therapy based upon Phyllis has talked about and written about. And so all that to say, we're going to do our best, but we're talking about sensitive stuff. So it can be a polarizing topic. But where should we begin, Phyllis? Phyllis, what was the impetus for you creating this book? Why did you want to write this book?
Yeah, I think there's many reasons, but the reason I'm going to start with speaks to what you just said. And that is, from all of my experience being a psychotherapist over so many years and working with hundreds of people, it really became clear to me that our psychology is the big missing piece in the conversations that you're talking about. The difficult conversations, the divisive conversations, the heated ones, the ones that sometimes even incite people to violence. Psychology is the missing piece because it's not about partisanship. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's not about who's good or who's evil. It's not at all about pitting anyone against another person or group. Psychology is all about healing. It's all about healing our relationship with ourselves and healing our relationship with other people. And if we could bring some of those best principles of healing to national conversation and somehow find a way to make that part of our politics, we could be on the road to healing some of the worst divisiveness and threats of violence that we're facing today. So that's really the impetus. And underlying that, and we can get into this more, I'm sure, with some of the questions you might have, underlying that is that from all my experience as a therapist, it became really clear, as it does to all therapists, I think, I'm not speaking just from my own experience or myself, that we become really familiar with what are healthy dynamics in a family and what are unhealthy dynamics in a family and what happens for people when they're in a family that's either abusive or dysfunctional or neglectful. What happens to them? What are their symptoms? What are the outcomes? Because we can take that family lens and look at all groups of people that function together through that lens. A school, a business, a house of worship, a community, a state, and a nation. We can look at the family of America and look at, are the dynamics we're running on, are they healthy family dynamics? How are we affecting people with the policies and practices that we implement and condone?
So The key premise, one of the key theses in this book is that you compare America to a family. America is a family. We're a big old family with a lot of folks. It's kind of complicated. But within families, every family, there is some sort of power dynamic. There are people who have more control and people who have less control. So when we think about America as a family, who are the people who have more control? Who are the people who have less control? Where do we fit in that? Where do our political leaders fit into that? What are the roles that you would associate with that?
So in a family and like in a business or in a school, people are in different positions of power. I think that's inevitable in human culture and human society, that we're going to have different roles and different assignments and different authority over others. The question is, are we healthy in the way that we implement our power over others? A parent has to have more power than their child. They just do. And they need to have that because the child depends on them for guidance and for direction and for their, for their being provided for and for what they learn about how to function in the world around them. So, of course, there are different power dynamics that happen, but a healthy parent doesn't beat their child. They don't molest their child. They don't kick their child out of the house and lock them out in a snowstorm or starve them. So the power differential is not the problem. The problem is how we implement it. So a healthy parent in a healthy family, even those with power, are willing to hear feedback from their children. They're willing to consider that different members of the family, their spouse, their children of different ages, have different needs, have different desires, have different talents. So there's a tolerance for diversity. There's a tolerance for feedback. There's safety in communication. There's a commitment that even when there is conflict or disagreement, that no one is going to become violent, either emotionally or physically. So there's an assumption underlying that while we may have different roles and different abilities and different places in the power structure, that we're all seen as equal and equally valuable and worthwhile as human beings. And if you take that lens and you try to look at a country through that lens, of course, we can see that we're very, very, very far from that.
America is a family, and we are a toxic, dysfunctional family, at least as it stands right now. We think about politically the amount of divisiveness that we see on party lines, the amount of that we see within given topics. Friendships are broken, families are broken up, right? We are a family, but we are a highly toxic and dysfunctional family, at least as we stand right now. I was wondering as I was reading this book, and it's a great read, y'all. You should definitely read it. I was wondering in this book, where does the family metaphor fall short, though? Because I want to set some boundaries before we dive into this, right? Because, anytime you're dealing with metaphors or you're using things to kind of illustrate a point, it's helpful to be able to understand, where does this fall short? So we're just kind of doing a damning admission, or we're table setting. Where does the family metaphor fall short when we're trying to understand family dynamics from a country?
I'm curious what you think. What initiated that question for you? Where do you think it falls short? And I'm happy to engage with that.
Man, who doesn't love someone who can just ask a question back to the host? I appreciate that because I spend so much time asking other people. Okay, so you're right. I do have a reason for this, and it's because I read the book. I thought about 3 particular examples, okay, of countries that have had varying degrees of what we would call family nation states that have arisen. And when I say I thought about this, I was talking this over with my wife, and we discussed this, and she's a PhD student, and so she has a lot of really good insight into this because it's part of her field of study. But she brought up 3 examples. One is North Korea. And if we think about North Korea, we think about they look at their leader, and the way the leader is presented is as the father of this country, and the people are the children, right? So there is an adoration. There is a sense of responsibility. There is a sense of paternal ownership and the paternal guiding. And that is in the language, the actual ethos of the way that people communicate within North Korea, right? And we can see how sometimes this could be abused because anybody who has that much power over other people and has that kind of clear boundaries can have abuse. The second type of family dynamic that we've seen, or we could call this like a country that's trying to own its stuff, so to speak, right? Is like Nazis, right? Within Nazi Germany. So we have Nazi Germany after World War II. They were like, yo, we messed up. There's a lot of stuff that we did that was clearly wrong. And they, as a country, decided that they wanted to come to terms with a lot of the trauma that they had inflicted on others. So they created monuments and they tried people on an individual level for their war crimes. And I thought that was really interesting is it wasn't like the country was put on trial. They were looking at specific leaders and trying them individually. And so they said, no matter what, we need to make sure that as a country, we are now supporting the Jewish people because we have gone so far in the other direction that it is our duty as a country to recognize this, to own it, and then to go in the other direction. And that comes at a cost because even then, and like full disclaimer, y'all, I'm a Jewish person. I'm a Jewish man, right? I have Hebrew tattooed on my arm. It says beloved, Dode. Like I'm a Jewish person. So I have to table set that before people would think I'm an anti-Semite. But that also comes at a cost when the country of Germany is supporting Israel in the genocide of Palestinian people, right? And so they go so far into rectifying their collective wrongs that it now becomes the other direction. And then lastly, we think about Canada, right? And so Canada, similarly to Nazi Germany, came to understand, hey, we messed up when it came to how we treated Native folks. Indigenous people were taken and they were put into boarding schools and their culture was erased and they were displaced. And we want to recognize as a country that that was wrong. But they did not do anything to actually change that. They admitted they were wrong, but there's no rectifying of the situation. There's no land back. There's no acknowledgement of funds. So it's words without actions. And so you see like three different levels of this. You see within North Korea, what this family dynamic looks like on a big scale. You see when people own up to their actions and their actions go off to one side at all costs with Nazi Germany and supporting Israel. And then you see with Canada, like as a country coming to rectify its own problems, but also not doing anything. And so I wonder, when we're thinking about the gaps in the family dynamic, the reason I brought this up is I think it can be helpful to look at it through a lens, but I also wonder what are the boundaries of that? Because it is a complex thing, right? That's why you wrote a whole book on it. And it's not something that's so easily unpacked for all countries everywhere. But I was curious, at least for America, where do you think the boundaries are?
Well, I think if we're looking at it through a psychological lens, you could look at all of what you said through a psychological lens. It's really how policy is made and what the psychological health is behind the policy that informs it. I don't know all the dynamics of North Korea, but from what I've heard, it appears that it's very totalitarian. You can't disagree with the leader. You can't leave. You can't individuate in a certain way that might challenge the powers that be. And so there may be a certain security for people in being totally locked into something where they can't move. But I would imagine that there are many, many people whose life force is very, very suppressed because they can't individuate in the way that we kind of understand in the world of psychology, that when a person is free, when they can when they can heal their own wounds and they can be in touch with their basic, essential nature, we each have a different contribution that we want to make. And in the society that doesn't make room for our individuality in some kind of cooperation and balance with the good of the whole. And that's really what I want to speak to, because I think that that's what happens in a healthy family. And it doesn't necessarily have a one size fits all, that it looks exactly the same way in every family because we are individuals. But I think in a healthy family, there's some sense of a balance between what's good for the individual, what supports the individual, what's safe for the individual, what creates value for the individual and supports them to become their greatest self in some kind of balance with what's good for other people, what's good for the whole. There's a word for that I heard several years ago, and it was called sovereign unity. So we each have our own sovereignty, and we also have a sense of our unity. And this is an ongoing conversation, communication, reworking, navigation of human relations. It's not a static thing. It's not a structure imposed on people. It's a continual dialogue between the individual and the collective, in a certain, if you could say that, or the individual and others. So when you're talking about Germany, for instance, beautiful that Germany as a country acknowledged the horror that was committed there during World War II. Is it also psychologically understandable that sometimes people go too far in another direction? In fact, that's often the case. And these are psychological issues. It's like we're way over here on a pendulum swing, of passivity or violence. And then we swing the other way to try to counterbalance the ills of whatever position we were in. And where we need to be is somewhere in the middle. But often people swing back and forth before they get to the middle. And I think what we're talking about is, I believe we need to grow the consciousness to come back to the middle really soon, because we are such a threat to ourselves. We are such a threat to one another. And I think in the world that we live in today, unlike past generations, it's very new that we have weapons of mass destruction. We have the chemical possibility of polluting the planet to make it uninhabitable. We have enough understanding of psychology to really manipulate each other. These are extremes of the things that we have created, that we could actually take ourselves out. And when someone is suicidal, an individual is suicidal or homicidal, which they're kind of combined here in what we're talking about, we say they need help and we try to find them help. And so that's part of the motivation for my book is, what is the help for America? What is the help for the human race to bring us back from such divisiveness, such violence, such investment in one person or one country or one race holding power over others that they don't know how to use and are not committed to use in a way that factors in the voices and the needs and the common good of everyone else.
This episode of Treatable is brought to you by Sandstone Care, which helps teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with mental health, substance use, and addiction. They provide age-specific, individualized treatment plans centered around your unique situation and goals, and they only use evidence-based therapies to help you get there. They keep their group therapy sizes small so folks can connect with others going through the same struggle and so that you never feel alone. They also give academic and vocational support to help you improve your grades or to get started on your career path. And lastly, because they know that mental health and substance use affect the people closest to us, they provide support for the whole family through their family therapy program. To learn more about teen and young adult treatment options, go to sandstonecare.com. Change is possible, and Sandstone Care is here to help. I really love how you unpacked the psychological nuances of kind of each situation. And just to summarize, one of the things you're saying is like, hey, we want to have a healthy family. If we look at North Korea, there wasn't the ability to individuate, and a good family is going to allow multiple people to exist in a way that allows them to be happy, but also supports the whole framework of the country. And then when we think about Germany and post-World War II, there is this idea of suppressing or trying to go too far in the other direction and at all costs, and not being able to see the need for balance because something was so out of balance, and so we go in the other direction.
Yeah, and let me add something quick about Canada, what you said about Canada, because that's also such an important psychological issue. One of the things that I stress, and I don't know how far you've gotten in the book, but I have a chapter that's on what are some of the actual tools for repairing after there's conflict, after there's divisiveness, after people have, really hurt one another or are afraid of one another or enraged at one another. How do you come back together? And the bottom line of that whole chapter, and I break it down into 6 sections, but the bottom line of that chapter is the best access to healing a relationship after conflict is taking personal responsibility and stop pointing the finger at the other person or the other party or the other country. It's really, who am I being? What am I doing to bring understanding? What am I doing? And this goes directly to your question about Canada. What am I doing to repair the harm that has been done? Many, many people in a conflict are completely focused on what they feel has been done to them, which is appropriate. We have to be able to say injustice was done. We were hurt. We were violated, whatever happened. But we also, and it's a part of psychology and it's a part of all good healing, we also have to take responsibility for our part in the conflict, our part in what hurt other people. And as a country, we have, whether it's America or Canada or any other country, just like any person, most of us, even with the best of intentions, even if we're not outright aggressors or violent ourselves, most of us have hurt somebody along the way. Most of us have been unconscious of our own motivations or our own actions, or haven't cared enough about our impact on other people, or feel too ashamed to acknowledge what we've done and we try to deny it or bury it or justify it. So part of mental health for a person or for a country is not just to say, I was wrong and I really did something that was harmful to another person or another group, but then to behave differently. That's part of personal responsibility. So acknowledging that the Native people in Canada were hurt is great. And it's only part of the process. The next step is, how are we going to make amends? How are we going to repair? And of course, that applies to America. Many, many people who came here originally as settlers and over hundreds of years fled poverty and discrimination and injustice and war, and they brought their traumas with them. And of course, they acted some of them out. And as a country, we acted some of those traumas out on Black people and on Native people here, and we still do. And we act them out on many marginalized groups of people. There's a lot of finger pointing going on in the United States today, and there has been. And it's part of human nature to do that, but it's also part of human nature to survive. And if what we're doing is putting all of our lives at risk, I think it's time to rethink all of our human relations.
Yeah. Let's unpack one of the things that you said when we're talking about this balance. So you talked about this need for autonomy. What is good for the person, and weighing that in proportion and balance with what is good for the country. In relationship dynamics and family dynamics, we hear the word respect a lot. You hear about this word in couples therapy a lot when it comes to respect. And I had one therapist break it down. There's a difference between respect of autonomy and respect of authority. And oftentimes when we think about somebody, I'm not getting respect, we feel like it's respect for authority, which isn't like a powerful thing, which is not a good thing in a relationship dynamic. You don't want to have authority over another human being in that way, right? But we do want to have respect with autonomy. How does a country balance respect for autonomy with the needs of the country? For example, the ability to pay your bills and to have a house and to provide for your family and to pay taxes and support our country and like be able to do utilities and the things that we need in infrastructure to support a country. How does one psychologically do that as a family?
Well, I think you start with having communication be open and safe. I think that's the bottom line, because you can't really know what everyone needs. You can't really begin to, if you want to use the word respect where other people are coming from or various needs that seem to differ from each other. It's really hard to factor those things into an equation of cooperation unless it's safe to disagree. And so the bottom line is that there has to be a commitment to nonviolence. because when people are threatened, they're not safe to disagree. And we see that, we see that all over the country, with, police brutality, with peaceful demonstrations being shut down and sometimes there's being assault. So we have to be able to have a voice. Does that mean that everybody's going to get their way? No. But you probably know this from your own experience. And I know this as a therapist and as a person in relationship with other people, because that's bottom line is that what we are. We're all in a relationship with other people. That to the extent that we can actually sit down and tolerate our own distress at disagreement or a different point of view or a need that doesn't coincide with mine, and actually hear the other person, bumpy, we're imperfect. It's sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I don't think anybody is a saint and does it perfectly, but if the commitment is there in a relationship that we know that no matter how much we disagree, we love each other, we care about each other, we depend on each other, and we're going to work it out. We're going to make a compromise, or I'm going to give up my position in favor of yours once I understand you, or vice versa, then it's possible. But there has to be communication to start with, in answer to your question. And without that, then there's just authority imposed and people who are forced to submit.
Yeah. This communication piece we have to be able to sit down and really be willing to listen to where somebody is coming from. And chances are, when we understand and we really listen to the reason why somebody believes the things that they believe, it's not for no reason. It's not for a silly reason. It's not for something that's stupid. It's usually based upon life experiences, the people that they've encountered in their life, the way that they've been treated. And it makes sense. And I think so much of this show of the Treatable Podcast has been about mental health conditions and addiction. But a common pattern is that the mental health challenges that we face and the way that we cope with stress and with trauma, they all work to some varying degree, right? If I'm depressed and I'm pushing down my feelings, it works to some degree because it helps me survive. If I'm sad and I'm feeling completely unhappy, drinking alcohol can work for a while, right? They all work to some degree. But the thing, and I think that your book does a really good job of pointing out, is that if those actions are perpetuated plus time for a long period of time, it does not work out in a healthy way. If it is the case over and over and over again, it then becomes this toxic environment that in the long run hurts us. And so, summarizing what you're saying, the first thing is we have to have safety, and we get safety through nonviolence. I cannot listen to you if I'm also afraid that you're going to hurt me. Yeah. That's a really hard place. In the therapeutic relationship, we've got to have this. I was watching a TV show, and this person took a therapist hostage and said, "Hey, I need you to listen to me." And the therapist was like, "Well, therapy is built on a trusting relationship. This is going to be really difficult if both of us don't feel safe." And she's like, "Well, I don't care." So you have to have this safety between two people. And then the second start is to communicate and to really listen to where somebody's coming from, because the reason why they have the perspective that they have is not for no reason. There's a good reason for that.
There's a couple of things in what you said. One of them is that safety is multidimensional. It's not just that I'm holding a gun to your head. It's that I'm not going to roll my eyes when you're talking. I'm not going to look at you with disgust, because that makes it emotionally unsafe. I'm not going to look down on you and give you a condescending kind of, response that implies that I'm better than you and you don't know what you're talking about, or you're stupid, or you're unvaluable. So safety operates on a lot of levels. Certainly no threats of imminent violence for sure, but I just wanted to say that it's a bigger picture than just overt threats. It can be subtle threats. It can be, well, if I don't hear what I want to hear, I'm out of here, kind of thing. So that's really important. And I want to say that sometimes it's hard to do. When people are really angry, when they're really hurt, when they're really frightened, or they're having some other really intense emotion, and they feel that the other person is all wrong and bad, it's really hard to listen. It's something that we have to commit to learning how to do. And anybody who's listening, or I can speak for myself, when you're in an intimate relationship, that's when you can get actually the most triggered in your most wounded places. And that's where we have the most fixed responses of defensiveness or blame or aggression or shutting down and walling the other person out. So this takes work. It takes commitment to have a safe relationship. It takes commitment to have a willingness to hear an opposing point of view. And the other piece what I want to add to this, and I talk about this too, is that sometimes the work is really with one person. If my wounds are so driving the boat of what I'm doing with you that I just can't help myself from being defensive or being unwilling to be open to you or attack you verbally or wall you out, if I can't overcome that automatic unconscious impulse, it means there's something in me that really needs to be healed. And I can tell you from all my years as a therapist that I've seen it happen over and over again when someone works on the conditioning they got that was hurtful. They were abused as a child, or they were neglected, or they had a parent who was raging, or they had a parent who was depressed and locked in a room, or who was an addict, or who abandoned them. When people go back and they heal the negative things they took on about themselves as a child, or even older than a child, from harmful relationships, when that begins to heal and they uncover their pure essential self that's been buried underneath layers of hurt and defensive and coping mechanisms that don't necessarily serve in their adult life, they invariably see how they're treating other people, and it shifts. I've never seen that not happen, that when someone really heals, their relationship with other people becomes more healthy, as well as, of course, themselves. But then they're more able to engage in the kind of reparative work with other human beings that we're talking about here. I had a client who, when she did some really deep healing work on growing up in a very depressed household and her own isolation as a child, she saw how she was treating her employees. She understood what she was projecting onto them. She was projecting her own wounds onto them, and she couldn't see them in any other way until that part of her got healed. It's a big thing to say if America was in therapy, because it really just means all of us doing our own work and bringing that to each other the best we can in small venues and large venues. How could we heal the things that we're carrying, that we project onto certain races or certain genders or certain nations? Because that's really where the healing lies. We're projecting our own unhealed wounds onto other people, whether it's individuals or whole groups of people.
So there's two things I want to point out from what you said, just summarizing for listeners and watchers. The first is that if I cannot listen to somebody who has a different point of view and compassionately just listen and try and understand where they're coming from, chances are there is some part of me and my experience and things that I have gone through that I have not processed, I have not healed, I have not forgiven within myself. There's some self-compassion that has not taken place. And once you have self-compassion, you are then able to give that to others. Once you have forgiven yourself, you're able to be able to forgive others or to listen to others, right? Once you listen to yourself, you're able to listen to others. And most of us we have these things that are deep down that are probably manifesting in a lot of different ways, but we distract it or we push it down or we don't think about it. And what happens is we end up playing these things out in our relationships over and over and over again. So first I have to forgive myself. And then in that process, I'm going to be able to listen to myself. And then in that process, I'm going to be able to listen to others. Is that right? Is that accurate?
I think that's very accurate. And of course, I just want to say nobody does it perfectly. Sometimes we do some healing work, we change our behavior, we have a better attitude, we're more compassionate, more patient, and then we lose it in a given moment. But what happens is the more we do that inner work, the more we do that healing work, the quicker we can catch ourselves and the quicker we can right it. Like, how many times have I been in a conversation with my husband where I'm reacting to him or he's reacting to me, and one of us catches it and we'll go, I'm sorry, I'm not listening to you, or I'm sorry, the tone of my voice probably didn't sound very good, or it didn't sound good. There's a wonderful couples therapist named Terry Real, and I believe he's the one who said, is a process of rupture and repair, rupture and repair. We're going to have ruptures. That's human nature. That's how we are. But we can learn how to repair, and we can learn how to repair quicker. We can learn how to repair more effectively, and we can ward off through that process the worst of our conflicts. We really can. We wouldn't do therapy if we couldn't interrupt some of these most dysfunctional and abusive cycles in human behavior. That's what brings people to therapy, is pain. Yeah. It's the wars they're in with themselves and the people around them that they can't resolve. That's what brings them for help. And if there wasn't any real help possible, if we couldn't interrupt that cycle of destructive relationship, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. Is it a perfect science? No. But it is something that we can all definitely implement. And I can tell you, I think with all honesty, that there probably isn't anybody who's actually implemented some of these healing techniques in their lives who isn't extremely grateful that they had the opportunity to do that, because it changes the quality of life that we live. We all want love. We all want to be loved. We all want to belong. We all want to be safe. We all want to be valued. And we all want to know that the people around us have a desire to cooperate and not hurt us. And yet, as a country, we have not adopted what psychology knows is best for human beings. So that's the gap.
So, yeah, there's this part of us that understands that we have these things in common, and yet we still have a tendency to focus on the differences that we have, and to also push down the things that we're dealing with that create a block from connecting with others. We've talked about on this podcast, when we did a deep dive into trauma, that all of us have the ability to do three different things. We can connect, we can fight or flight, or we can freeze and dissociate. We're born being able to do those things. When we look at our mother's eyes, when we feel her heartbeat, when we feel the pace of her breathing, we can connect, we can laugh, we can smile when she smiles, and so forth. The one about those three that I think is really interesting, and you've already touched on it, but it's a consistent theme in the early chapters of your book, is this idea of freeze and dissociate, and how oftentimes when someone has experienced a trauma, one of the reactions that you can do is nothing. You can push it out of your mind, or you can push it down. And I'm sure there's a listener or a watcher who's thinking to myself, man, these problems, they're all so big, like they're so complicated. I actually have no power in this whole situation. I actually can't do anything about it. And so they do nothing. And that's psychologically, as you've mentioned in the book, that's a coping mechanism. That's something that people do. So what do you want to tell people who might be feeling that sense of overwhelm, especially in the context of our current political environment?
I think a lot of people do feel that overwhelm. And I think the first thing is to identify that feeling of helplessness and powerlessness as a symptom of the dysfunction of the larger family system, because we're not wired to feel powerless and helpless. If everybody felt powerless and helpless, we just wouldn't survive as a species, right? So we learn, and this is a term in psychology, learned helplessness. We learn to be helpless for certain people, many people do, when they're so overpowered and there's no escape, they can't have a voice, or they have learned through experience that if they try to stand up for themselves, if they try to get help, if they try to escape, if they try to assert their own needs or their differing point of view, they're going to get hurt worse. Then that becomes part of what they've internalized. Like, it doesn't serve me to stand up for what I believe is right or for my own safety. when you have abusive families or you have abusive systems, you're creating more and more people who feel helpless and powerless. And then they are more easily manipulated and controlled. But I think the important thing is, and this is the other half of what I was writing about in my book about that, is the people who don't become helpless often are what in psychological language we call those who identify with the aggressor. And so there's a role model that you stay on top by being aggressive and dominating other people. And many people who have been in dysfunctional and abusive systems identify with the aggressor. Their own vulnerability is so terrifying to them, their own helplessness in the abuse that they sustained or the dysfunction that they lived through is so terrifying that they have chosen unconsciously to identify with the aggressor, and they become the aggressor with their own children, with their spouses, with the people who work for them or the people they work with or in their community. And I say this, and so for better or for worse. And if they run for office, they bring that with them. And it's very, very dangerous to have more and more people who feel helpless and more people who have identified with the aggressor, because then you have a setup for domination and submission. And as a therapist, I can tell you that over the years of working with so many families and so many individual people's family histories, it's so common that someone who feels passive or powerless ends up with a partner who's dominating, because someone who's dominating doesn't look for a partner who's dominating. They look for someone who they can control. And the person who is controllable is just repeating what they know, that they already were dominated and they're still trying to get love from somebody who dominates them.
Sorry, I just need to sit in that for a second.
What did that bring up for you?
I think my biggest fear in life, if I think about my own family dynamics and how I grew up, I think one of my biggest fears in life is having a perspective or a point of view that is toxic or unhealthy and not being aware of it and going throughout life and inflicting that on other people. It's like smelling bad and not knowing it. It's like having something in your teeth and not being aware. But the beauty of community is that we can actually talk to each other about these things. We can work these things out. We can actually, like, it's interesting. It's like something my wife does every single time we eat out. And it doesn't matter if we're in like a public place or if we're like at home, is she'll say, "Hey, do I have anything in my teeth?" And she'll like give me like a huge grin. And 99% of the time, somehow she doesn't. But what that shows is a lot of trust if you think about it. Being willing to talk to another human being and to say, "Hey, is there something wrong with this? Is there something here that I need to know?" And being open to the feedback, right? And I think so many of us, and I know, and let me just like draw this metaphor out. That's not something I ever do because I'm always afraid that I have something in my teeth and that I'm going to look the fool. And what does that say? It says that, hey, there's something that I know could be the case, but I'm actually kind of afraid to bring it to the surface because if I do, I don't want to look stupid, right? And I think a lot of us feel this way. I think deep down, most human beings are afraid that if people knew the real them, if they saw them for how they really are, how they think about them, that they would be judged, that they would be misunderstood, that they wouldn't be accepted, that they would be cast out of the tribe. And they're so willing to belong that they're willing to not be themselves or to push down who they are, to not present themselves for the sake of at least identifying with some people, right? But I'm sorry, you were going to say something about
No,
that
I
metaphor.
think what you brought up was so right on, because first of all, I think we still live, even though our culture is constantly changing and there's more information available all the time. And despite some of the repression, there's more and more voices available to be heard in America, I think, still, and hopefully will remain that way. But what you're saying is we don't do it in isolation. We actually really need safe people around us. So if your wife said to you, even if you didn't ask her, and she said, "Hey, you have something in your teeth," how would that be?
Be like, okay, like, hey, at least I know.
Exactly. So we just become that for each other. And, you know, you've probably heard of Brene Brown. She became famous because she did a TED Talk about vulnerability. And it spoke to the need of untold numbers of people to be able to embrace their vulnerability and work with that and show it and not be ashamed of it. And we're still a long way from that, I think, as a total culture and as a human species. But I think that's growing, that there's an understanding that our ability to say, hey, not only do I have something in my teeth, but did I hurt your feelings when I said that? You look like something happened when I said that. And it looked like you shut down, or it looked like a feeling of hurt went over your face. Or I'm in a relationship that's safe enough that you can say, let's stop for a minute because that really hurt my feelings. And then I grow the ability, the distress tolerance to be able to take that in and reflect on myself. These are signs of emotional intelligence and emotional maturity that I think we're desperate to grow in our country as a whole. So part of it is distress tolerance. I don't know anybody who likes to get negative feedback about themselves, but we need to have it. And if you have a totally authoritarian system, whether it's in a family or a community or a business or a nation, and there's no place for safe feedback, then there's no place for that reflection either.
Yeah, there's no place for a different point of view. There's no place for, imagine a parent or imagine a family and a kid is struggling with something, right? And he or she is unable to like bring it up and to feel like that their parents support them and want to understand them and really want to make things better. That would be a sad family to be a part of. You wouldn't feel safe. You wouldn't feel connected with those people. That feels bad. And I feel like that's the narrative that a lot of people have with our current political system and the way that they look at it on both sides. That's the way they feel.
Right. Because we haven't committed on both sides to sit down and have that kind of open conversation with really just tolerating our own distress at the differences and listening. And there are many groups around the country that are experimenting with and implementing now, bringing people from across the aisle to talk with one another. And one of the articles that I read about that, and you might have read that in my book, was that one of the participants said, when we actually sat down and talked, we weren't that different. But if we don't talk, you probably know this in your own life. I certainly know it in mine. If you don't work something out with another person, we start to imagine all kinds of things about them. We fill in the blanks with our worst fears or our worst judgments, and they're doing the same about us. So the whole point of nonviolent, peaceful conflict resolution communication is essential, whether it's in our own lives or in a country.
Yeah. We have to be able to think about, all right, so here's an experiment for you listeners or watchers. Think about wherever you are on the political spectrum, left or right, and imagine somebody on the exact opposite side of that. If your knee-jerk reaction is that this person is not smart, has no feelings, is stupid, is ill-informed, then chances are there's some listening that has to happen. Chances are there is a construction that you've created in your brain about who this person is that's disconnected with their actual story. Everybody is a villain until you understand their backstory, until you understand the chain reaction of events, some within their control and some without of their control, that led them to where they're at right now. But everybody is doing their best to survive and to live a life that they feel happy with. Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants to feel, as you mentioned earlier, that they belong, that they're loved, that they're needed, and that things are going to be okay, that they're safe, right? And so if right now, when you think about those people, that exercise seems impossible for you, right? The first thing is to, notice this. How do you feel in your body right now? Going on with your breathing and your heart rate? And then to say, why is it that this is a challenge for you? Why are you unwilling to listen to them? Why is it unreasonable to think that this person might have a reason for this? Because to your point, if we dive into this, no matter where you're on this political spectrum, you're going to find that there's probably a lot more things that you have in common than you have different. Will it be easy? No, but it's essential. It's essential for us to heal. Just like if this was a rupture between you and your spouse or your partner or your brother or sister or a parent, you have to be able to listen and understand where they're coming from.
And you know what I've found, and you probably found this as well. What I've found is that one person can change the whole dynamic in a relationship. So if one person is willing to do what you're talking about, to be responsible for their own behavior, their tone of voice, their body posture, their words, if they're willing to be accountable for their own missteps and make amends and offer some kind of way to reconcile or, come together, make an agreement, the other person is much more likely to do that. It's that attack, defend dynamic that keeps the verbal and the threats of violence going. So we can all learn how to be that person. We can all learn how to be the person. And again, it's hard work. Peace is hard work. Peace is not the desire for peace is not a weakness. It takes incredible strength and courage. Just reacting and being violent is easy in a way. To actually control your own self and to be responsible for your own behavior and stop blaming is, I think, the hardest work for human beings to do. But what happens, and I've seen this over and over again, if one person does it in a relationship, it's so much easier for the other person to come around and want to do that too, because the fight goes out of the conversation.
Yeah. And that carries over for every topic. So for example, I remember when Donald Trump was elected and there was the Women's March in Atlanta. I went to the Women's March and I remember that there was a huge variety of people there. And there was also a huge variety of signs. But one of the things that really stood out to me was how much of the rhetoric and the signs were pointed against like physical appearance of Donald Trump, physical, characteristics. And when we perpetuate those things, right? Like when we say we don't want anyone, especially a political leader, to call out things about a person's physical appearance or their cognitive ability or their physical ability or, their background or nation of birth or any of those things, we feel like that's wrong. And then we do that and we turn around, we do those kinds of things to the same figure that we're opposing or that we're against or whatever. We're perpetuating a violent act. We're perpetuating a paradigm that doesn't have any room for growth, that actually isn't conducive for change in a positive way. And so there couldn't be a more pertinent time for this book. You've written this at the exact time I think it is needed. The book is called America in Therapy, a new approach to hope and healing for a nation in crisis. Where can people go to get this book, to learn more about you and all the awesome work that you're doing?
Oh, thank you so much. Well, the book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all the major booksellers. And you can also go directly to my website, which is my name, www.phyllislevitt.com. You can buy the book from my website. There's lots more information about the book, about me, and about what this is about on my website. I have lots and lots of video interviews on YouTube. I'm on all the social media, Facebook and LinkedIn, and I have a lot of articles on Substack. If you go to my website and you contact me, you can get a free copy of a PDF that I created that's called The 6 Secrets to Repairing Relationship After Conflict. And we were talking a little bit about it. It's outlined in much greater detail in the book. And the PDF I made is not just a copy of the chapter in the book. It's really an expansion of that chapter that was designed for a person to use in their own individual life. And you're welcome to have that for free and share it. So if you go onto my website and you contact me, you will get that automatically. I welcome if you contact me and you have a question and you want to talk with me. I'm open for that. And you can also email me at my business email, which is phyllis@phyllislevitt.com.
Awesome. I read it. It's amazing. Read it. It will help you understand our nation in the context of family dynamics, completely different perspective, a fresh perspective. Go get it. I really appreciate you for being on the show, Phyllis. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Listen, listeners, watchers, this whole America and turmoil and divisiveness that we have, it is real. And we know that it is much more common than ever. But with the help of reconciliation, of nonviolence, coming to terms with our own challenges and traumas and stress, and being able to listen to one another, it's also treatable. We'll see you on the next episode. This episode of Treatable was edited by Daniel Lopez. The intro and explanatory sections of the episode were written by Alexandra Kruger. The theme song was created by Sebastian Gonzalez, and the cover art for this episode is created by Joel Daniel. If you got any value from this episode, it would personally mean the world to me if you would leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps to spread mental health awareness to more folks, and I read each and every comment that people leave. So tell us what you appreciate about the podcast, and you just might hear us feature it on the next episode. All of my love, and we'll see you on the next one.